I mean, this question is, obviously a very complex one, and I think the crisis of democracy is in a way overdetermined. I mean, there's so many different aspects to it that it's almost, difficult to bring them in an order without, ending in desperation or in a kind of sense that, okay, if that's the situation, it's really difficult to imagine a way out of it. I mean, just to mention a couple and then maybe zoom in on one. I mean, there's clearly an ecological crisis, the question how far the mode of living that we've come to accept as normal is sustainable. There are scholars who describe it as an imperial mode of living, simply because it's premised on forms of extraction and domination, exploitation, exclusion, etc. that enable parts of the population to live a very comfortable life with driving every day to the supermarket or to the daycare, etc. Living in a house that is nicely heated and so on. Whereas that's only possible because large parts of the world's population cannot afford such a life. There's clearly linked to that an economic crisis beyond the kind of financial crises that the media seems to mostly focus on. There's an underlying crisis in the economy. So it's been described as the neoliberalization of capitalism, its financialization, extractive capitalism, something that is very familiar, I guess, from the Canadian context, also here on the island, and the whole discussion about pipelines, etc. There's a democratic crisis or a political crisis in the sense of what has been called the hollowing out of the institutions and more broadly the practices and sort of life forms of democracy, citizen disengagement, disenfranchisement of populations, democratic deficits of all kinds that come in at various levels, from the supranational, where maybe it's the easiest case to sort of see the democratic deficit. We have a lot of power and domination and institutions that are partly exercising that power, partly it's corporate power, and very little political channels of accountability or contestation that reach up to that level. But also at the national and even the local level, there are ways in which power is shifted from more or less democratically accountable institutions to less accountable ones. The problem with the whole post-democracy discourse is a bit that it suggests that there was a kind of golden age of democracy, and now we're sort of moving away from that. That's quite problematic, I think, because democracies, as they actually exist, have always relied on excluding large parts of the population, and we have to keep this sort of reality also present in the ways in which we want to think about the future or futures of democracy. And I think in a way you have to understand the crisis as one that goes really deep and has therefore also no easy solution in order to sort of think radically enough about the possible futures. So we talked in the workshop a lot about the kind of medical metaphors that we tend to use in thinking about crisis. I mean, crisis itself is originally a medical term, right? It's the moment in which a trajectory from health to sickness reaches a critical point, a moment of decision in a way, where it becomes obvious what is going on and also that something has to be done. And this presupposes a diagnosis before you can come up with the therapy. It presupposes that we are sort of clear what kind of patient we're talking about. And all of this is, in a way, contestable, right? It has been contested theoretically, politically over the last years. And I think, therefore, also if we speak about crisis, it's always good to ask, who's speaking about the crisis, for whom, of what particular type. What I think is maybe my way into an answer would be to look at connections between responses to these crises. So, and I'm thinking now particularly about responses from the margins, if you want to call it that way. or from below, which is also a problematic metaphor, but the idea would be to think about especially movements and forms of political and social struggle that, in my view, often have an epistemic function. They produce crises as also epistemic occasions in which those who are not primarily involved, either affected by the crisis or involved in the movement, are, as Martin Luther King says, forced to confront a crisis and accept that there is a crisis, and then learn to look for a solution to the crisis. And I think some of the most interesting movements today, and I'm thinking now particularly about indigenous struggles that we've learned so much about from fellow Canadian and indigenous political theorists, but also in the context of the US, maybe more than in Canada, African American struggles, be it in Black Lives Matter or in other contexts, and then what I've been working on more, migrant and refugee struggles, where many of the people involved in these struggles start to very much see the connections between them, from the perspective of an ordinary citizen who's not part of one of these populations. They might seem very disparate and they might not have much connectedness, but I think all three of them highlight that a large part of the problem, and therefore probably not part of the solution, is how the modern state has been organized and what the both the actual reality of that state and also the imaginary that is tied to it, or the ideology that is tied to it. The idea of a national community with clear boundaries, territorially situated, and sort of giving itself a unified, not only identity as we, the people, or the nation, but also a unified set of institutional, constitutional rules, the homogeneous political order, as it were, that this whole idea is part of the problem, and that this whole idea has produced, to a certain extent, these categories of excluded, marginalized, repressed, in many cases annihilated populations. So I think what we can learn from that is that it's important to connect these different aspects, and that makes it hopefully possible to not just respond to specific symptoms, but rather to see at least part of the underlying causes, and then to think of ways to address both symptoms and causes in ways that don't just reproduce the causal mechanism that led. I don't say the modern state is to blame for everything, obviously, but it's definitely part of the problematic mix of things that came together and landed us in this mix. And that's also why I think that what you find sometimes also on the left, a kind of appeal to a return to the nation state, is really not at all the way forward. And that's why like Brexit, for example, and other attempts to somehow re-empower the nation state, I think, really go in the wrong direction. I mean, they do as if the nation state has not been very much involved in getting us into this mess in the first place, and as if now we could somehow repurpose it as a solution, which I think is a very problematic thing to sort of aim at. Rather than think in terms of, in a way, solutions that might already be there, or that we just have to sort of seize on, I really think that the challenge is to identify, in a way, sites of experimentation where solutions might evolve in the future, and that's partly to do with the complexity and the dauntingness of the problem, and it has also partly to do, I think, with the fact that it's probably not the job of the theorist or the scholar to say, well, I surveyed the options and actually this is the solution, but rather to help, very much in the spirit of Jim Tully's public philosophy, to help in a dialogue that is relation of reciprocal elucidation and learning, to help in the self-articulation of practices that already exist, bring them together, see the connections in a way, and in that way hopefully lead to sort of incubators for change that already to a certain extent exist, but that, for example, sometimes are not necessarily aware of each other, although in the cases that we've mentioned before, the connections are being made by the agents on the ground themselves. But I think it's also important that there's probably still, I think there's still a role for theory to play in this whole ensemble of practices, communities of practice, as you mentioned before, to which the theorist, I think, has to see herself as contributing, as being embedded in. But I think it's also important that theory can play a role in, for example, highlighting problems that sometimes you can forget when you're immersed on the ground. So, for example, problems of scale. Yeah, some of the very promising experiments are very much tied to local context, and that's great, and that makes them possible in the first place. But we're also talking about extremely complex societies that you might find niches where communities can survive, flourish, etc. in niches that will then be tolerated by the state or by the society at large. But if you have to think at some point about alternative ways of organizing society as a whole, or even global society, then you're confronted with immense problems of scale, where to move from the kind of grassroots initiatives that seem so promising to many of us to even mid-level scales of regional integration, etc., let alone large macro scales on the global level, etc., that's a really daunting task. Yet there's no alternative to do the kind of work from the bottom up, right? And I don't think that any top-down solution would be that promising, given the history of how these have backfired or just tended to reinforce the problem. So I think, again, epistemologically, I would say the starting point should be in actually existing practices, forms of experimentation, but then also we need to be very aware of the challenges that they are often facing, and that might sometimes get lost if you only focus on how can we here and now realize an alternative, sort of locally speaking.